Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups. We're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem. Digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time. Today, we're diving into something that made everything click into place the first time I heard it, Dr. Gina Colvin's concept of ordinary Mormon trauma. This isn't about dramatic abuse or obvious dysfunction. It's about the everyday, normalized experience of growing up in a culture that teaches you to be nice but not kind, obedient but not teachable, and disciplined but not regulated.
If you've ever felt like you had a good Mormon childhood, but still ended up trying to figure out why you felt like you were not showing up in your life the way that you wanted to, why you felt like you knew better, but you just felt unable to do better, this episode is for you. We're giving you language for experiences you've always had, but maybe never understood as traumatic, and talking about how healing is absolutely possible. So today, instead of examining a specific case, we are exploring a foundational concept that helps explain so much of what we talk about on this show. It's called ordinary Mormon trauma, and it was coined by Dr. Gina Colvin, a former Mormon in New Zealand, host of the podcast A Thoughtful Faith.
When Hannah first shared Dr. Colvin's definition with me, I had one of those moments where someone puts words to something you felt your entire life but never had the language for. It was like she'd reached into my childhood and perfectly articulated experiences I didn't even realize were traumatic. And suddenly, so many faces from my ward came to mind, people who embodied every aspect of what she was describing.
That is exactly how I felt. I felt like nothing had summed up my Mormon upbringing as fully and thoroughly captured my experience as well as Dr. Coleman's analysis. It was like someone just followed me around my entire childhood with a notebook, noting how this experience was shaped. So we're going to break down what ordinary Mormon trauma is, why it matters, and how it shows up in ways that most people, including those experiencing it, including me until recently, might never recognize as trauma.
Yeah. If you grew up Mormon like we did, or really in any high control religious environment, this episode might hit close to home, and that's okay. Sometimes having language for our experiences is the first step toward healing.
So let's start with Dr. Colvin's definition. She begins by painting a picture of what we are meant to be as human beings. She says, "We were made for tenderness and gentleness, for openness, authenticity, vulnerability, compassion, and caring. We are each threaded through with the strands of genuine goodness, our true selves, our inner landscapes are beautiful and are potentiated for wholeness and fullness and love."
Wow. I mean, she does such a good job of creating an image of what feels to me almost like a golden life, charmed even, because it feels so pure and inspired. And it's important that she starts there because it establishes what human development is supposed to look like. We're meant to be whole, authentic, vulnerable, compassionate beings. It's our natural state.
Right, it's a natural state. And then Dr. Colvin explains how trauma complicates that. She says ordinary Mormon trauma is that everyday experience of being in a culture that has never resolved its formative pathologies or repented of its institutional sins. Mormon trauma is passed on from one generation to the next.
The phrase never resolved its formative pathologies is crucial here. This isn't about individual bad actors or isolated incidents. This is about systemic dysfunction that was baked into the culture from the beginning, and it's never been addressed.
And because it has never been addressed, it has never been resolved. And because it has never been resolved, it gets passed down. Mormon parents who experience this trauma raise their children within the same system, perpetuating the cycle, not recognizing what is happening. And then that trauma becomes so normalized, everyday, ordinary, that you do not see the water you're swimming in.
Yeah, Dr. Colvin says that this trauma shapes the way we experience the life of the soul, which needs wide open doors and windows for the heart to grow. In Mormonism, that life can be diminished because trauma limits. And I personally really related to this when I had left the church and was working with a therapist. She one time told me it was her turn to talk. And she sat down with me and she said, Jessica, when I listen to you, I am reminded of a plant that has been deprived of sunlight and deprived of nourishment for far too long. You need to push yourself back into the sunlight, feed yourself, nourish your soul so that you can become who you are, who you know you are meant to be. And hearing Dr. Colvin describe that need for wide open doors and windows for the heart to grow, it really resonated with me in a way that was just so powerful.
Yeah, it's my favorite line actually of her whole description. It really speaks to me too. I mean, because it's so central to our humanity that we get in touch with that. Of course, we need the right conditions, but Mormon culture creates the opposite. It creates closed systems, rigid boundaries, and constant surveillance of every aspect of your life, including your inner life, your very most thoughts.
Agreed. 100%. So Dr. Colvin moves from this imagery and her analysis gets really precise. She identifies how Mormon trauma creates an environment where it's okay to be a list of surface level traits, but not the deeper, authentic qualities. These contrasts really capture it. Nice but not kind, disciplined but not regulated, curious but not open, service oriented but not care oriented, and devout but not holy.
Right. Each of these hits so differently when you really think about it. Like being nice versus being kind, that's huge. Nice is performative, it's about maintaining social harmony and not causing trouble. And kindness is about genuine caring and compassion, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable.
Exactly. And disciplined but not regulated. Mormon culture creates people who can follow external rules perfectly, but have no internal sense of what's healthy or appropriate for them personally. I had a friend in grad school. He was a Mormon who had served a mission. He'd been married in the temple. And as he was helping me move furniture one day, we're riding in the cab of the truck and he's marveling to me about my internal compass, my moral compass, and how strong it was, even though I had left the church and have no current faith. He told me that he'd probably be like the Unabomber were it not for the church keeping him on the straight and narrow. And I remember kind of giving him the side eye and, thinking that he was cracking a joke, but he really wasn't. He was sitting there straight faced. And I realized, okay, this is disciplined and not regulated.
Right. Perfect example of being disciplined but not regulated. Like if you don't have somebody telling you what to do and left to your own devices, the idea that you would just run amok and, be a chaos agent, causing harm to other people. It's like, why would you do that just because nobody's telling you not to? The thing that really resonated with me in that list was I was definitely, and I'm going to caveat this by saying, I think part of this was I was raised, my dad worked for the church. So he was a regional representative for the church educational system. And that meant that he was really looked to as a kind of authority on church doctrine. I mean, that was his job, was to have those answers, right? to the CES letter, the famous, infamous CES letter that many people found online, the idea that you would write to your CES representative for these answers, it speaks to sort of the weight and authority that these men tend to be given. So I could ask questions about doctrine or history, and I did frequently, but only there were obviously spoken and unspoken acceptable parameters. So I couldn't be truly open to possibilities that might challenge the fundamental framework. And then I remember just being so confused about the mixed message, because we were told to ask questions. And then when I did ask questions and I never got an answer, well, I mean, I would say a satisfactory answer, but it's like, it's a non-answer to just be like, it's not an answer to say, I don't know. And then you say, well, I thought I was able to ask questions. And it's like, you are. So it just feels like so gaslighty, to not to overuse
Right.
that,
But you
but it
are
truly is.
only within certain acceptable parameters, right?
Right.
You don't go outside of the line.
For
That's
sure.
you.
But I digress.
No, I think it's really a salient point, as are so many of these that Dr. Colvin is listing out for us. The service oriented but not care oriented. This describes so much of Mormon culture. Like, you'll have people who will show up to help you move or bring you dinner when you're sick, but they're never going to actually sit with you in your pain. And they're not going to see you as a full human being with complex needs. That's too uncomfy. Not going there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I'm the only one who has had the experience of kind of needing a family member's help, who was too preoccupied with making meals for the sick and, going and visiting the shut-ins, as my parents call them, and it's like, well, that's nice that you're there for the ward members. Okay, right on.
Right.
Worthy, but not good. This one cut deep. The Mormon concept of worthiness is basically about rule following and sexual purity. And we'll talk more about that in future episodes. It's not about actual goodness, and it is not about character development.
Exactly. And that disconnect between appearance and substance, it runs through all of these. Here are some more: confident but not integrated, gratified but not delighted, sacrificing but not open hearted, obedient but not teachable, and repentant but not merciful.
Confident but not integrated. I feel seen. That was me. Mormons can often appear very sure of themselves and their beliefs. A little too short
A
sometimes.
little too short. I agree.
And that confidence is often brittle, because it underneath is not based on genuine self-knowledge or integration of all parts of one's self.
No, because that requires expansive thinking, which is really suppressed in this culture. For me, the obedient but not teachable was particularly painful. Mormon culture just creates people who will follow instructions perfectly, but they can't actually learn and grow because they're not allowed to question or explore or make mistakes. I remember asking why as a kid and getting, because I told you so, or because that's what we do. Responses that just snuffed out my curiosity instead of nurturing it.
Well, did you ever get the classic, we don't know, but it will all be explained after we
Oh
die?
gosh, yes.
And it's okay. I just have to say, a favorite in my house was the Great Lecture Theatre in the Sky. That's what my mom used to say.
I didn't hear that one.
No, she used to say, no offense to my mum, love her dearly, but she used to say, well, it will all be explained in the Great Lecture Theatre in the Sky, so you don't need to worry about it now, because God will make it all right. And I'd be like, but I'm not okay with it now. But it will all be
Okay.
explained. It will all
But
be explained.
be led blindly like sheep. Yes. Wow.
Okay, next on that list that you just went through, repentant but not merciful. So folks who are raised Mormon like you and me, we can perform the mechanics of repentance, but not genuinely extend mercy to ourselves or others, because mercy requires the kind of open-heartedness that the culture we were raised in did not allow.
Yeah. And that's an important distinction, the mechanics versus the heart of it. The final contrasts really drive this home. Self-absorbed, but not self-reflective. Doctrinal, but not theological. Certain, but not whole. Dependable, but not safe. And accomplished, but not formed.
Wow, dependable but not safe. That's Mormon culture in a nutshell. You can count on Mormons to show up most of the time, to fulfill their callings, to keep their commitments, but they are not necessarily safe people to be vulnerable with.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's because vulnerability threatens the performance. If you're struggling with doubt or depression or your marriage or your sexuality, anything that doesn't fit the Mormon success narrative, really, you learn very quickly that being honest about it makes people uncomfortable. Not only that, it makes them ostracize you, lest you continue to make them uncomfortable. They're really quite protective of the status quo.
Yeah, right on. Now, here's where Dr. Colvin's analysis connects to a fundamental theological contradiction in Mormonism. And I was thinking, actually, as we went through that list, that central to my upbringing was two words: mixed messages. And all of those contradictions, I mean, you could call a mixed message a contradiction in another way, right? So here's a theological contradiction. The Book of Mormon teaches that Jesus Christ redeems us and allows mankind to act for themselves, not to be acted upon. Agency is key.
Ah, that's from the second book of Nephi, chapter 2, verse 26. It's supposed to be one of the core principles of Mormon theology, that agency, or the ability to choose for yourself, is the whole point of existence.
I did not know you were such a master scriptorian, Jess.
I always was winning this, the scripture chase in seminary.
Actually, I smoked the scripture chase, but that's a
I'm
story
sure
for
you
another day.
did.
Oh, what a nerd. Okay, so yeah, Dr. Colvin points out that the church implements the opposite, right? In a system where members are supposed to have agency, you're actually acted upon and not permitted to act for yourself.
Yeah.
Prove me wrong.
Nope, can't. I mean, what we're seeing here is this creation of what Dr. Colvin calls the recurring trauma of constantly reacting to church leadership decisions. If you think about it, extending callings, releasing from callings, changes to policies and practices, members are always in a reactive state. They're never in control.
Right. You get to be called Young Women's President. Didn't ask for it. You weren't consulted. You cannot say no. Actually, they ask your husband before they ask you. They call your husband in. We want to call your wife to be Young Women's President. You okay with that? And if the husband goes, no, I need her at home more, they'll go, well, we'll reconsider. But if the husband gives the okay, then the calling is extended to the woman, but regardless. So you have no choice. You cannot say no. You know that.
Mm-hmm.
That's de facto. So 2 years later, you're released without explanation. Maybe there was a conflict. Maybe someone complained about you. Maybe they just wanted someone else in that role. You'll never know.
But you could also experience some kind of policy change from the church that completely upends your understanding of doctrine or practice. Like, remember when they changed the definition of marriage? So what they did was in 2015, they excluded same-sex couples, but then reversed it in 2019. So members were expected to immediately adjust their beliefs and testimony to match that new position, and they're expected to do it over and over, whatever the new current position might be.
You might have to change your stance on something overnight. And how do you cognitively do that? Like, that seems like a cognitive impossible task. The psychological impact.
Right. And what's the internal narrative that you're telling yourself to justify it and to make it all make sense? You know, I don't, the mental gymnastics are astounding.
And I had to get like really, despite having a background in counseling, educated on what is happening on a biological level when you are experiencing this state of coming and going in limbo and constant reactivity. And the impact that it has physiologically and psychologically is profound. The body keeps the score. I'll probably say it every episode. You learn growing up Mormon that your thoughts, feelings, and preferences do not matter. You learn that you have no control over major aspects of your life. You learn that stability and predictability aren't things you can count on.
Right. And you learn that questioning those decisions or expressing discomfort with them is evidence of spiritual weakness or pride. The system is really designed to make you doubt your own perceptions and reactions. Let me share an example from my own experience. When I was interviewed by my bishop before I was baptized, so I was maybe 8 or not quite 8, I remember feeling so worried because I did not feel the spirit as he said that I should. I really did not feel at all ready to commit myself to lifelong commitment to the church. I don't know if they do these kinds of interviews anymore. I remember, though, thinking I was surely not old enough to be making this kind of sacrament. And it was more than just a passing thought. Now, this was the kind of questioning that should be encouraged for a curious and thoughtful and maybe kind of smart alecky child like I was, but it was absolutely frowned upon.
Right. It was not allowed.
No, that wasn't allowed at all. And it caused me to feel this crushing guilt and fear. You know, I had been taught that doubting was dangerous. It invited Satan's influence. So I pushed the thoughts down. I buried them deep, deep inside and tried to force myself to feel the spirit. I didn't understand yet how damaging this pattern of thought suppression would become.
Yeah, it really is thought suppression, isn't it? You're sort of, I mean, I told you the other day that probably every child raised in Mormonism was told that they were to pray and ask if the Book of Mormon was true, right? This was an
I
instruction
was.
we were given
Right.
repeatedly. So you were given the edict to pray and ask if the Book of Mormon was true. And if you did it with enough faith, you would have it revealed to you that the Book of Mormon was true. But here's the caveat. If you didn't get that answer, you were to do it again until you did. And if it didn't happen, you were to do it again until you did. And then again until you did. And I remember just being so desperate to manufacture the feeling so that I could have like done the assignment, right? I did it. I prayed, I asked if the Book of Mormon is true, and I got the confirmation. But I couldn't lie to myself, right? I couldn't pretend. I knew the truth that I hadn't felt shit. So there's a get out of jail free card that I must have picked up along the way through sacrament talks I had heard people say, which was that they too have had the same exact experience of not getting a confirmation. But then the spirit whispered to them, you always knew it was true. You always knew it was true. You have to say it twice for emphasis.
Like Beetlejuice.
Right.
Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice.
Exactly. That's so I just remember being like, oh, okay, so if you can't manufacture this feeling, you can always come up with that. And so I went, oh, well, you always knew it was true, so you didn't really need that confirmation after all.
No, and you just have to suppress that, right? You have to suppress that doubt. Like, why wasn't I feeling it? Why wasn't I feeling it? Oh, well, I already knew it was true. That's why I didn't have some profound revelation. And that's that pattern of suppression
Yeah,
right
it's
there.
that 100%, sorry to interrupt you, is that gut feeling that Dr. Colvin talks about. So being primed to ignore the instinct that something isn't right. So two significant examples that come to mind. One, I remember sitting in a temple, veil over my face, and looking around as much as that was possible with my face veiled, and thinking, who is going to be the first person to acknowledge that we must all be mental? To look at this situation. Are we all mentally ill? Right? And so there's that feeling of like, this is not right. This is not okay. But you are required to eliminate that thought, replace it with the idea that that thought must have been put there by Satan. Otherwise, I mean, it had to have been.
Now
right?
your own recognition that this is
He's working on you
fucking
day and night.
ridiculous.
He is working on you day and night. Very significantly, when you are primed to ignore the feeling that something isn't right, I was in an extremely unhealthy relationship with an extremely abusive person. And I remember saying to myself, Hannah, get out. This is not good for you. This is not healthy. This is not right. And when I finally extracted myself from that situation and looked back and wondered why it took me so long from having the knowledge and the acknowledgement, I realized that I had had a lifetime of practice in ignoring my instinct that this is not okay. Right? But I was so good at being like, well, that must have come from somewhere else. Some untruth out there was planted in my brain.
I mean, that makes sense because you really do lose touch with your inner wisdom. I never went to the temple, but I have a similar memory, from church, and mine was really related to gender roles, which is something I can't explain it, but just from a very young age, I felt like I needed to be rebelled against. But I was probably 12, sitting in Young Women's, and we're talking about our future roles as wives and mothers. I remember sitting there thinking, what if I don't want to do that? What if I want to do something else with my life? I mean, frankly, at the time when I was 12, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to go to law school, be a lawyer, and then I wanted to drive a BMW. And I think importantly, I also wanted my name to be Veronica because I thought that was more glamorous than Jessica. But
You had it all planned.
I did. And being a wife and mother, not on the list. It really wasn't.
I've heard so many people say that they felt obligated to have kids that they otherwise would have made, the choice not to. For me, my trauma response was to just say, yeah, make me a mother, and as soon as possible, just fully bought into that idea that my entire existence was about being not just a wife, but most especially, I think, a mother.
Yeah, I will say, I do love being a mother now. I think my kids are, the best thing I've ever done, honestly. But for me, reconciling the fact that my desires and dreams didn't matter at all in terms of what the church was teaching me, so disappointing. I was taught that there was only one acceptable path for me as a woman. And if I questioned it at all, it was questioning God's plan for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, 100%. Yeah. I mean, we all internalized that message. And yeah, it was daily reinforced. Dr. Colvin says that ordinary Mormon trauma is most profoundly felt in not being culturally or institutionally permitted to be our true selves, but to live in this highly controlled world where we are treated as potentiated for evil and best kept managed.
Potentiated for evil and best kept managed. That's the perfect way to describe it, really. The message is that you can't be trusted with your own life, your own choices, your own spiritual journey. You need constant oversight and control.
Yeah, and if you didn't have it, like your friend said, you'd become the Unabomber, right? That's the
Or
idea. So
worse.
he bought into that. The trauma of not being your true self, like Dr. Colvin says, is felt like death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one big traumatic event. It is the daily experience of being suppressing who you really are and just having to perform an acceptable version of yourself.
Yeah. And I can think about all of the small moments of self-betrayal, those 1,000 cuts, right? Laughing at jokes that aren't remotely funny, but somebody who was a priesthood holder is telling the joke, so you're gonna laugh. Sitting
Mhm.
quietly, biting my lip because I'm listening to someone say something racist or homophobic, and I know I can't challenge it because of the conflict that it will cause. And even pretending to feel the spirit when I felt nothing. All of those things.
Yeah, it really is a self betrayal. Like I was talking about trying to muster up a testimony. And you're the only one who knows that. I mean, like I said, I said I couldn't lie to myself. And it's like, well, I mean, I sure as shit tried. Like
Mhm.
I tried really hard bearing my testimony about things I knew that I could not say I knew were true, but I definitely knew the what was the alternative to there was no alternative. I wasn't going to
No.
say
Mm-mm.
I'm not really sure. That would have been radical. Um yeah, I mean, right down to like, I think about how Brigham Young, dictated. So when we say this is baked in from the beginning, Brigham Young in his discourses would dictate to the saints, like, I'll permit you to eat a little rice. You can, I mean, it's so controlling every aspect of their life. And, it institutionally, think about someone controlling who you can date, right? Who you can be attracted to. I mean, it's so limiting that you're probably end up with people that you might not even be attracted to necessarily, but you're sort of limited by the pool that you're allowed to pick from.
Yeah. Well, and the cultural norms that are created in that type of environment where you have so much control. Like it meant for me avoiding friendships with people who were non-members because they might be a bad influence, or avoiding R-rated movies and certain music. I can remember them playing like clips of music in Sunday school, like that we're not supposed to listen because they were singing about cocaine or something. And while this, the music and the movies technically were not against church doctrine, everyone knew that they were the gateway to eternal damnation. So you
Hmm.
just didn't do it, even
Hmm.
even if that was what you wanted
Hmm.
to.
Yeah, these accumulations of small betrayals. This is the death by 1,000 cuts. You might go, well, that's no big deal. Yeah, okay, definitely not individually. Now times it, multiply that by 100 times a day for your entire life. Right? So it creates this chronic sense of disconnection from yourself and your own life. You are living someone else's script. You don't even realize it. I mean, I spent most of my life up until healing completely dissociated from my own body, right? Just literally not living my own life.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Hannah. I, I have to say this. All of these small, self-betrayals and this death by 1,000 cuts, environment, it really is particularly insidious in the way that it gets passed down from one generation to the next. Like parents who experienced this, like this was their upbringing, this was the environment that they knew, they raised their children within the same system.
Right? Not because they want to hurt their children, very few parents want to hurt their children. That would be the extreme minority of sociopaths and psychopaths, right? It's because it's what you know and it's what you believe healthy spiritual development looks like. Again, what's the alternative?
Right. I mean, I think about my own parents. They genuinely believed that they were giving me the best possible life by raising me in the church. They thought that they were protecting me from the dangers of that big, scary outside world.
Same. Yeah, absolutely same. Obviously, what they were actually doing, yours, not, it feels a bit blamey, but that's not my intention in stating the obvious, right? That what this actually does is teach a child that you should distrust your own instincts, that you should prioritize what other people think of you and their approval of you over your own well-being, and that you are fundamentally flawed as a given, right? As a given, and in need of constant correction. And what do you need if you need to be constantly corrected? Well, you would also need to be constantly surveilled, because otherwise, how could we be correcting you? So you've got don't trust your own instincts. What other people want for you is more important than what you want for yourself or what is good for you. You are flawed, and we're going to have to keep an eye on you at all times, watch you, and make sure you never get out of line.
Yeah. And, because all of this is allegedly done with love and good intentions, it's so much harder to recognize as harmful, I think. It's not like having an abusive parent that's obviously destructive, right? It's you're having loving parents who participate in a system that is subtly destructive.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this heartbreaking contradiction where parents will say, I just want you to be happy, while simultaneously restricting every path to happiness that doesn't fit the Mormon mold. To this day, my dad still tells me and my siblings that we just don't know how unhappy we are because we've left the church.
Yes, yes. I want you to be happy, but mark my words, you will achieve it this way and no other way, right? That happiness will come from following these commandments and staying in this church and living this way, and any other way of living is suspect. It is like the literal definition of gaslighting for you to tell someone, listen to this conversation. If you wonder whether growing up Mormon negates your sense of self and autonomy, someone says, I want you to be happy. You respond, I am. They say, no, you're not. You just think you are. Fuck you. I mean, it's like, okay, then. Where do we go from there?
I know. I am blissfully happy. Everything in my life is going the way I wanted it to. Yes, I still struggle with certain, getting to the gym as many times a week as I want or whatever, but hearing like you just don't know how unhappy you are. That's such bullshit.
It's
Such
like, well, I
gaslighting.
feel happy. I feel perfectly happy. So I'll take it.
Yeah. I mean, that's
I win then. Yeah,
I
you
can
just
tell
think
you
you're
the
happy.
contrast.
You just feel happy. You just love your life, but it's an illusion. Okay, great.
Well, I'm
I like.
I'm sticking with
Yeah,
it.
okay, I'll take feeling happy. Okay,
I
it's
know.
whatever you
I
want.
mean, we joke and we talk about our parents and our upbringing as if like Mormon families are bad, and they're not. Mormon families can be incredibly loving, like genuinely, deeply loving. But at the same time, they're also emotionally unsafe. Like your parents love you, but you can't tell them about your doubts. You cannot talk to them about your sexuality, your real dreams, and your actual struggles. Those are no-goes.
Yeah, and then children learn to protect their parents from those feelings.
Yep.
The idea, I don't want to disappoint my parents. I don't want to cause my parents pain, right? So you become expert at managing everyone else's emotions, totally outside of your control, but not going to stop you trying, and ignoring what you need.
Right. I mean, I developed this lovely habit of making myself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger. Family drama, I would absorb it. Tension in the room, obviously my responsibility to diffuse. It was like I was a human shock absorber. I was great for everybody else's comfort, but terrible for actually having my own needs, my own opinions.
Mm, that's really interesting because I think I developed the lovely habit of making myself bigger in the room, right? Taking up more space because I felt so middle of 5 children, 4 children born in less than 3 years, right? Like there is definitely something to be explored there, right? About having
Yeah.
these large families where children are competing for resources, very material resources in our
Mhm.
family, right? Um, and yeah, so just the different way that we might respond. We were both raised in Mormon families, and
Mormon
obviously all of our
families. Yeah.
experiences are going to be like completely idiosyncratic. What's actually wild is that Dr. Colvin captured something that both spoke to so equally to both of our experiences, and
Mhm.
we had quite similar and quite different upbringings. Dr. Colvin talks about how Mormon culture has never resolved its formative pathologies. And so those pathologies she doesn't articulate, but I, among other things, you've got fear-based control, um, massive, authoritarianism, controlling every aspect of your life, and the sexual shame that you are raised with around just a fundamental part of your human nature. These are pathologies that get passed down unchecked and unchanged.
Yeah. And ironically, each generation thinks that they're doing better than the last, but they're really just varying the same themes. Maybe they're less strict about some rules, but the fundamental dynamic is the same.
Yeah. I hope we are doing better generationally on the whole. Um, we like to think, right? I mean,
Mhm.
children are so perceptive. They pick up on their parents or the anxiety in the home, right? They pick up on the way that their parents suppress their own authenticity. Even if no one talks about it directly, children are incredibly perceptive.
I learned very early that certain thoughts and feelings were unacceptable. And it's not just because anyone explicitly told me so, but because I could sense my parents' discomfort when I expressed them. And that is how trauma gets encoded through what's said and through what's felt, what's avoided, and what's left unsaid.
Yeah, that brings up a memory. Don't even talk to me about how my mum responded when I asked her as a little kid, "Mum, what's a lessee?"
Oh my
That's
God.
we'll
I
go
can
there
only
another day.
imagine.
We'll go there another day.
But those reactions to situations like that, they teach us so much about what's acceptable and what isn't, often more than any explicit rule ever could, right? These moments teach you, I'm sure, and children that certain topics, certain feelings, even certain kinds of curiosity are just flat out dangerous.
Right, right. And I know that, not everybody would have experienced such an extreme response to innocent, like
I
natural,
heard this
normal,
word.
curious
What is it?
questioning of a child, right? I heard a word. What does that word mean? Right. So, I mean, to some degree or another, though, I think when we're raised Mormon, it's not just the education about sexuality, it's the shame that's baked into it, right?
Yeah.
So instead of learning, I think, about human sexuality in a way that we would consider much more healthy, um, if you have your natural curiosity, you have questions. If you ask the wrong questions, the discomfort that the person that you asked um, feels is like, as a child, you learn not to go.
Right, because it's somehow your fault. And really, it creates adults who can't navigate their own or others' sexuality in healthy ways. You end up with people who get married without ever having honest conversations about sex, desire, compatibility, because they've never been allowed to explore those topics safely.
Or people who cannot even identify what they're feeling. Hi, I will raise my hand, let alone communicate about it. Because if you learn that your feelings and thoughts are off limits, how are you going to get in touch with them and explore them? Right? I
Yeah,
mean, there's
yeah,
nothing to reflect on if you're
yeah.
not allowed to think what you think and feel what you feel.
Yes. And these moments, whether it's asking about sexuality, questioning doctrine, or just expressing the wrong emotion, they add up. I don't know. These
Yeah.
reactions teach us so much about what's acceptable and what isn't, often more than any explicit rule ever could. And when you multiply that across millions of Mormon households, you start to see how these individual moments of discomfort and avoidance shape the entire culture.
Yeah. Of course, these shape an entire culture. The concept of ordinary Mormon trauma helps explain so much about Mormon culture that I mentioned, like the mixed messages, the contradictions. Why are Mormons, this is kind of a superficial example, but so kind and helpful, but also so judgmental and controlling, right? I mean, they're operating from a surface level. So nice but not kind, service oriented. What was it? Service oriented but not
Care
care oriented.
oriented.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it explains why Mormon communities can feel so welcoming and supportive when you're following the script, but cold and rejecting when you step outside the lines. It also explains why so many people who leave Mormonism struggle with identity, with boundaries and self trust. When you have spent your whole life being told who to be and how to think, figuring out who you actually are is terrifying.
We were talking about your friend earlier. What came up for me was that it's almost like cliche at this point that so often, if you have been raised to be so rigidly controlled that, an adult who leaves a church, who leaves a highly controlled religion, will often act out wildly like a teenager because it's like, no one's stopping you. Well, you have to stop yourself,
Yes.
right? Like, you don't need other people to
Regulation.
stop you. You're your own set of brakes. I'm thinking about the Mormon communities that I've lived in Utah and Idaho and elsewhere. And I think it explains why Mormon culture produces so many people who are incredibly accomplished, because most of the Mormons I know really are highly educated and incredibly accomplished, but also deeply unhappy. Because if you've learned just to achieve and perform and also to follow those things that are very performative, right? Like that people you can get accolades for, but it might not even be um, what your whole authentic self wants. You're chasing after somebody else's vision for you. Perfectionism, anxiety, depression are rife in Mormon communities, and the research literature shows it, right? And these are not character flaws of you or me or anyone else raised in this highly controlling religion. It's not spiritual weakness. It's not an inherent wrongness. It is a natural result of a system that demands performance of perfection over authentic self, being your authentic self.
Yeah. And the weird thing is, most people experiencing this don't recognize it as trauma because it is so ordinary and so normalized. It's just how things are.
Right. And that's why I think this concept is so important, because it does give language to experiences that you've had but never understood as traumatic.
And once you have that language, you start seeing it everywhere. The way Mormon kids learn to read emotional cues before they can even articulate what they're feeling. The way entire families can go years without ever having a real conversation about doubt, about sexuality, or about authentic emotion.
Yeah. You could go just forever without having a
Mhm.
real conversation. Just keeping everything surface level.
I
100%.
have still never had a conversation about sexuality with my parents.
Oh God, I've had way too many. Way
Okay,
too
that
many.
that doesn't surprise me.
I can't even. I will build up enough emotional reserves to tell you one day what my dad's response was when I was a kid. I asked him, like, why do people have sex? Because to me, that seemed like really wild and out there. Like,
Horrifying. It was
yeah, why would you
horrifying.
do that? I mean, I know what it is, but still don't understand. Like, I'm playing with Legos over here. It's way more fun. And one day I'll tell you what his answer was, because, oh, goddamn.
Oh.
But I was just thinking about, like, yeah, I mean, yeah, we unfortunately, doesn't mean there was depth there, but the content was there, right? For me, it's hard to say, like, when I left the church, because, it's a life. When does that process begin? When does it end? Right? Like, what is that? But I do know that there have been milestones, I guess, as it were, of grief that has come up that I didn't expect, right? Like losing a version of yourself that you had to be to survive in a system that did not allow you to be yourself. Well, now, in order to become yourself, you're going to have to lose, the other version, I guess.
Right, that whole community of people, the whole lifestyle that you had lived your whole childhood, adulthood, whenever it is you decided to exit. People who've been raised in the church will say, I had a good Mormon childhood, but then they'll spend years in therapy unpacking why they can't trust their own instincts or why they feel like they're performing in their own life. And it's because of this ordinary trauma that we're
Mhm.
talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if they're insightful enough, they spend years unpacking it in therapy. But I just think the majority of people probably never ask that question. Why can't I trust my own instincts? But this conversation is for those of us who have, right?
Right.
It's intergenerational. Our parents experienced the same emotional suppression and they passed it on to us, and they are not bad people. They were clearly operating from their own unhealed trauma, not just our parents, all parents.
Agreed. And I know earlier I said ordinary trauma, and it's really understanding ordinary Mormon trauma, knowing that it isn't about blame, it's about recognition. Once you see the pattern, then you can start to interrupt it. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in these descriptions, first of all, you're not alone. This is incredibly common among people raised in high control religious environments.
Yeah. And recognizing it is the first step towards healing. You cannot change what you can't acknowledge.
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge that recognizing this trauma can initially feel really destabilizing, especially if you've been telling yourself you had a good childhood. Suddenly, you're questioning experiences that you thought were normal and healthy.
I am going to attribute this quote to Charles Baldwin, but I could be completely wrong, so we can fact check this later. I just thought about the quote, one of my favorites. Not everything that is addressed can be changed, but nothing that is not addressed will be changed, or words to that effect, right? You can address things and they won't necessarily change, but I can guarantee there'll be no change if they're not addressed at all. And I'll find the correct quote and post it in the show notes.
Oh, yeah, that's a really powerful concept. If you don't even know that it's there, if you don't even look to it, you can't
But
do
to go back
anything.
to, sorry, just to go back to, like, not blaming our parents or complaining, right? So, I mean, feeling like you're complaining, it's not complaining. You might feel guilty acknowledging, right? Once you can have to hold these sort of two truths simultaneously and acknowledge that they can both exist. I had loving parents who did the best that they could. My parents' good intentions, despite how good they were, right? There are also impacts of the system I was raised in. Period. End of story. Both of those things are true.
And finding community with other people who have experienced this and who understand this, for me, has been really crucial. There's something so validating about talking to someone else who gets why bearing testimony really felt performative and why you just couldn't trust your own feelings.
Oh, no shit. I know my sister wouldn't mind me sharing this, that she sought out a therapist who specializes in religious trauma. And in the intake call, she said it was so refreshing to have somebody cut to the chase and get it, right? So she said, as the typical question a therapist would ask is, what brings you here? And so my sister said, well, I was raised Mormon. And the therapist was kind of like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then she says, yeah, this is a therapist. She says, okay, yeah. So yeah, it must have been hard growing up knowing that your parents loved the church more than you.
Oof.
And
Ah,
he was sort of like, okay, I found the right therapist because at least you understand Mormonism. Because she went, yeah, it was
ding ding. Yeah.
incredibly painful. It's incredibly
Mhm.
painful to know that truth. So
It is.
healing, healing involves, for me, there are multiple pathways. For me, I had to learn to parent my own inner child differently. I had to show up here. I had to show up for little Hanny. This is little Hanny. Um, go away, little Hanny. I had to really parent my inner child. I mean, that's a whole other discourse about healing. The main takeaway is that I do get to trust my own instincts, right? So now when my younger self shows up, doubting, scared, not confident that we've got this or that I've got her back, um, I am just able to tap in with curiosity and go, yeah, okay, well, let's sit with that. Let's explore that together. That for me has been so much part of the work of healing.
Yeah. It really just comes down to, instead of the old internal dialogue that we had that said, stop thinking that, it's dangerous, you can say, your feelings and thoughts matter. You are safe to question, to doubt, to discover who you really are. And the healing process isn't about becoming bitter or angry towards the people who raised you this way. That's not what we're promoting. Most of them were doing the best they could with what they knew.
Mm, totally. I have a friend who's a clinical psychologist, and she was talking one day about how someone had said that they didn't know how they were feeling. And she says, I mean, isn't that strange? Who wouldn't know how they were feeling? And I thought, you're right. I was like, well, I didn't say it, but I thought, okay. So that tells me that this is someone, good for her, lucky her, who has never been dissociated from her own experiences, right? Which is, part of that is just to learn the difference, um, to, to reclaim your authentic self, right? Is to learn to trust your perceptions, to hear that instinctive voice and know that you can rely on it, to have boundaries, to make choices based on what is helpful and healthy for you, not what looks good to other people.
Yeah. It's about learning the difference between being nice and being kind, between being obedient and being teachable, and between being worthy and being good. It's, for me, it introduced a whole nother way to measure who
Mhm.
I was. It was, did I act with intentions that were pure, that I believed in, rather than what somebody else was telling me I needed to do? Did I respond to that person in that conversation in a way that felt authentic to me? Yes. Then I was learning, and I am continuing to learn the difference through
Right.
all of the things that I was taught, that I experienced, and that I was immersed in growing up Mormon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%. For me, I was just thinking about making your feelings acceptable to others, right? I had to learn that not other people's feelings are outside of my control. So this idea of I'm going to disappoint somebody or cause somebody pain, I had to get over that. I had to learn that that was theirs to deal with. It was totally out of my control. How they respond to my life choices is out of my control.
Yep. That says more about them than it does you. That was, oh God, I think I was 38 when I learned that lesson. I was far too old.
No, whenever it happens, just think you might never have learned that lesson.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Another important aspect really is learning that conflict isn't necessarily dangerous, or that disagreeing with someone doesn't mean the relationship is over. That I can have my own opinions and still be lovable. Another powerful message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, these patterns run deep. It is ongoing work. This does not change overnight. Like the idea that you said disagreeing with someone doesn't mean the relationship's over. I learned growing up Mormon that if couples who started off together, both Mormon, if one of them left the church, the other one was justified in leaving them, right? So that was a powerful lesson that the relationship is over if you don't think the same way I do, right? That was so baked in. It was like, we don't believe in divorce unless your spouse leaves the church, and then you're welcome to. It's like, when you think about these patterns, right, and how nobody wrote it down, it's just, you know, the hidden curriculum of growing up Mormon. There is something so profound about being able to name what happened to you.
And that brings me back to where we started, right? Dr. Colvin says we were made for tenderness, gentleness, openness, authenticity, vulnerability, compassion, and caring. Those are not weaknesses to be managed or controlled. They are strengths to be cultivated.
100%. I love that she says, we were made for wholeness, fullness, and love. We deserve to live from that place, not from a place of fear or performance.
If this episode resonated with you, we encourage you to do some research on religious trauma and consider working with a therapist or a coach who understands high control religious environments.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to Dr. Colvin for articulating my own experiences. And Dr. Colvin has a podcast called A Thoughtful Faith, where she explores these themes in much more depth. We will link to her work in the show notes. She, as of 2025, still identifies that she's the host of that podcast. I'm not sure how often it's updated.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. I just want to remind listeners that recognizing that you've experienced trauma isn't about blame or victimhood. It's about understanding your experience so you can make choices about how you want to move forward.
Your true self, that beautiful inner landscape, it's there. It might be buried under years of performance and people pleasing and anxiety, but it's there. If this episode brought up difficult feelings for you, be gentle with yourself. Healing's possible. You deserve to live as your authentic self.
You do. We all do. Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, you can subscribe. You can follow us on Instagram at Postmormon Postmortem. And if you really want to help other people find us, a quick rating makes a huge difference.
Thank you. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and follow. If you didn't like what you heard, you can forget this ever happened. We'll be back next Friday to talk about more cultural dysfunction and religious deconstruction. Until then, remember, whether you left last week or last decade, you belong here. You're our eternal family. No temple recommend required.
Hey, Hannah, before we go, I just want to say I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.